So I have a few more thoughts about the Microsoft acquisition of Activision. It's finally going through. I made a little short for it on my Call of Duty channel. See, I was struggling, because I wanted to make a full video, but I work nights, so by the time the news dropped, I had to get to sleep to go to work, so I only made that little 50-second thing. But it's hard to explain my position in a minute or less, because it is the unpopular position that this is a bad move, that this is bad for the video game industry, it's bad for the consumer, and that this deal should not have gone through. Now, the typical assumption one would have, me saying this, is that, oh, you're just a Sony pony, you're mad because Xbox has won and Sony lost and this and that. Like, if you guys know about me and my history, you know that I'm a PC-only gamer pretty much at this point. Like, I never touch my console. I play my Xbox One to play some old games that either are not released on PC or they don't have any online players on PC in the case of the older Call of Duty games. But as far as PlayStation is concerned, I have not touched my PS4 in like 5 years or 4 years. I think the last game I purchased on the PS4 was like WWE 2K19, I think. If you don't believe me, you can look up my PSN, Mr. NoobTube Gamer. There is no activity recently on there. And I do not have a PS5 either. So it's definitely not from the position of a Sony fanboy. I couldn't give less of a shit about whether or not this hurts Sony or not. I just simply recognize that this is not something that benefits the consumer at large. It just doesn't. So we're going to get into that. I wasn't sure whether or not I wanted to post this video on this channel or the Mr. NoobTube Gamer channel because that technically I have more subscribers on there, but I feel like this channel's been gaining a lot more traction lately, and also I feel like, it's one of the biggest things to ever happen in the video game industry in probably 15 years. So I think it's something that kind of fits this channel a little bit more, even though it directly affects the Call of Duty series, which is what my Mr. NoobTube Gamer channel is all about. So I'll probably leave a link to it in a community post so that both of my audiences can watch it. One of the few rare instances where both of my channels kind of interlap with each other. But yeah, so let's talk about this, okay? The recent news of Microsoft's acquisition of Activision, it was like $60 billion. It's been tied up with the FTC for a while, but a federal judge just blocked the injunction from the FTC, so the deal is effectively going through. But this news has led to widespread celebration among the video game community. I would say it's overwhelmingly on the positive side. I'd say 80% of the people are very happy about this. I find it completely absurd that most people are hailing this move as a triumph. Supporting the consolidation of power and the dominance of megacorporations over the gaming industry, cheering on as one of the largest video game corporations in the world gets swallowed up by an even bigger corporation, that's just the epitome of corporate bootlicking, if I've ever seen it. I get it, Microsoft, they've kind of gained a little bit of a cool reputation over the past few years. Everybody loves Phil Spencer. He's a very charismatic guy, and people kind of feel like he's just a really swell dude who wants to make video games better for everybody. But at the end of the day, he's just a businessman like every other businessman, and profits are the main motivation here. And in the case of Xbox, it's all about Game Pass and bolstering up that service and getting a whole lot more millions of people to sign up for it. That's what the primary purpose of this acquisition was for. And I get it, people like Game Pass, they don't see the threat that it poses to the video game industry, and they don't see how it actually is a very dangerous thing when we're talking about the quality and integrity of video games as a medium. You guys can choose to be oblivious to that because we haven't really seen the real effects of it yet. This is something that's going to really be more of a problem in the next 5 to 10 years than in the present day. But mark my words, Game Pass is going to be the downfall of gaming. Just like how I predicted back in 2016 that VR was going to be nothing more than a niche, and it hasn't really grown that much ever since. And also, Google Stadia. I said in April of 2021 that Google Stadia will shut down in 2023. And guess what happened in January of 2023? Google Stadia shut down. So, saying that Game Pass and subscription models are going to result in lower quality games and an overall worse video game industry, and also the effect that the Activision deal is going to have. Everything I'm going to say in this video and everything I've said in previous videos about Game Pass, it's all going to come true, just like my predictions on VR and Stadia have already come true. Game Pass is going to be the death note for video games. People talk about it now, obviously, that modern gaming is trash. But once Game Pass and these subscription services become the mainstream thing, the mainstream way to play games, people are going to talk about the good old days of the early 2020s when video games had at least some artistic integrity left in them and didn't become Netflixized, where quantity is prioritized over quality, and the point of a game is to bolster subscription numbers, but if the game doesn't do that, then, well, they're not going to make a sequel, or they'll just lower the quality of the game even more, because who cares? You're only paying $15 a month, or even in a few years it'll be like $20 a month. Still, it'll be considered relatively cheap in the grand scheme of things. You get hundreds of games, access to hundreds of games for one subscription price. It's a shit model for the video game industry. Wouldn't be so bad if it was just a back catalog of games, but since they're doing day-and-date release for Game Pass, it's not a good thing. This isn't just me making up random bullshit. It's already happening right now with the TV and movie industry, where they're critically acclaimed shows that people love so much, but it's only going to go to season 3 because the subscription numbers didn't increase as much as we wanted to, so there's no point in us continuing. Same thing with film. There's a reason why people's quality standards are much lower when it comes to a Netflix movie. It's kind of its own category. Oh, it's a Netflix film. My standards are going to be a lot lower. I'm going to judge it a lot less because, well, it's part of my subscription, so it's not like I'm going out to the theater, paying like $15 and then buying popcorn and all that stuff. Like, it's just that the standard of quality is a lot different when we're talking about paying $70 for a video game versus $15 a month for a subscription. Not to mention the issues with game preservation that this would pose, because it's pretty much inevitable that it's going to become the widespread form of adoption. Like, the whole idea of an individual game purchase will become obsolete the more prevalent Game Pass and other subscription services become. So what happens to all your games? What happens to your game progress when said game leaves the service? With a TV show, who gives a shit, because you can just stream it illegally. It's a lot easier to preserve, but a video game, it's a lot more complicated than just that. So yeah, that's another big problem that doesn't get talked about enough. So the point I'm trying to get at here, and you guys know it's a point that I've made before if you subscribed before, and I'm kind of beating on a dead horse, but I really think it's important to talk about this because it kind of emphasizes the problem here, is that this is a move. The reason why Microsoft bought Activision is to basically make Game Pass a more mainstream thing. But Game Pass becoming a more mainstream thing is not just bad for the entire video game industry, but it's also bad for the individual games that fall under the Activision Blizzard umbrella. Whether we're talking about Call of Duty, which is really like 90% of what Activision Blizzard puts all their resources into, but there's also Overwatch, there's also Warcraft, Diablo. Every single one of these game series is going to become lower in quality as a result. The Call of Duty franchise has already faced accusations of creative stagnation in recent years. People saying that the Call of Duty series has reached a low point with, insert game here. Like every single year people say that. It just gets worse and worse and worse. But I remember 10 years ago when Call of Duty Ghosts came out, people were saying that this was the low point. It couldn't get any worse than this. Well, it did get worse. I'm not trying to say that Call of Duty is completely fine. What I will say, though, is that if they just knocked off the skill-based matchmaking, Call of Duty would be 10 times better than it is right now, just by doing that alone. And hey, if Microsoft does that, then maybe just by that, Call of Duty will get better. But I just don't think that this is going to be a good thing for any of the Activision Blizzard games. Interesting thing, though, people are saying, well, it's not a big deal because Call of Duty is going to stay on PlayStation, which Microsoft has confirmed, and that's like the whole reason why this purchase was able to stand is because it's actually going to stay on PlayStation. But they never said anything about Diablo. They never said anything about Overwatch. They never said anything about Crash Bandicoot, etc., etc. I can guarantee you that Call of Duty will be the only one of these franchises that's going to stay on PlayStation and also come to Nintendo in a gimped version for that system. I mean, even though we're like maybe a year or less away from Nintendo's next generation system, the way that the specs are looking, it's going to be a little bit more powerful than a PS4 Pro, which is kind of like what people expected, but that ain't going to be able to keep up with the new generation of consoles. Never mind the fact that by the time the new Nintendo system's halfway through its life cycle, it's going to be like the PlayStation 6. So realistically, these games are going to be horrendous on the Nintendo platform. Think about Black Ops 3 on the PlayStation 3. That's the kind of shit that we're going to get. Literally, the only reason why Microsoft made a deal with Nintendo is to make the regulators happy. They're like, look, we made a deal with this other console manufacturer and we're putting our games on there. Oh, look, like that's literally the only reason. And that's also the only reason why it's on PlayStation. The reason why other games are not on PlayStation, like Starfield, is because Sony is not allowing Game Pass on their platform. That's literally the only reason why Starfield is a Xbox and PC only thing. But with Call of Duty, when you think that it can't get worse, it always does. People said it can't get worse for 10 years, and it's been getting worse consistently. So yes, it can get worse from here, and it very likely will, because Microsoft paid a lot of money for Activision. Over $60 billion. Okay? So they have a lot of money to make up for, whether it's through Game Pass subscriptions or whatever else. They need to maximize profits. That's going to be their main priority. So why would they have any reason to innovate when it's been proven that games that prioritize a safe and formulaic game design, it's always more profitable over daring experimentation? I mean, look at the Call of Duty series right now is making more money than it ever has throughout all of history. Modern Warfare 2019 was the best-selling Call of Duty of all time, and even though Cold War, Vanguard, and Modern Warfare 2 didn't sell as well as Modern Warfare 2019, it still is making more money right now between Warzone, between the multiplayer and the battle passes and all that shit combined. So when you talk about the downfall of the Call of Duty series, it's a perceived decline in quality, which is something that I do agree with, but why do you think that just because a bigger corporation is now in charge, but they paid a lot of money for it, why the hell would they just all of a sudden change the formula up, do all these experiments, and try to change it when right now it's making more money than it ever has? No, things are going to stay the same before they're going to change. That's A. B, it's going to be part of Game Pass. Subscription models like Game Pass often offer a vast library of games for a relatively low monthly fee, which sounds great and all, but it can also inadvertently create an environment where consumers are more forgiving of games that fall short in terms of quality. We saw a lot of them over the many, many years of Game Pass. Crackdown 3, High on Life. Outer Worlds is also another one. If you paid full price for the Outer Worlds compared to just having it on Game Pass, your opinion of that game is going to be drastically different, right? So as a result, there's going to be a lot less pressure on developers to deliver exceptional experiences or invest significant resources in refining and polishing their titles. Now, the jury's still out on Starfield. We don't know how good or bad that game's going to be. It's like less than a month and a half now from that game being released. It could completely knock it out of the park, but it being a Bethesda game, I am very, very skeptical. But even if Starfield does end up being an amazing game, well, first of all, it'll only be an amazing game because of the modding community. Just like every other Bethesda game, I can't see how this is going to be any different. Second of all, if it does end up being a really good game, it'll be the exception and not the rule, because Microsoft's first-party lineup during the Xbox One has been, it was pathetic. There's no other way to describe it. It was pathetic. But their entire strategy that generation was to bolster Game Pass. So having all their exclusive games day and date on Game Pass and also released on PC because they wanted to put Game Pass on PC as well. The strategy was to put as many games on there to attract subscribers versus Sony, which was to get people to buy their consoles to play their games and to be part of the PlayStation ecosystem. Now, they're kind of fucking that up with putting their games on PC, but the difference between Sony and Microsoft quality-wise over the past decade, it's been pretty significant. You can't name a single first-party Xbox game over the past decade. And I'm not even a Sony fanboy, but I just gotta keep it real. Like, you can't name a single Xbox game over the past 10 years that has come out that has even come close to reaching the quality of a Horizon Zero Dawn, God of War, Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, The Last of Us, Uncharted, Bloodborne, Spider-Man, and even the mid-games like Days Gone and The Order 1886 were about the same level of quality as the best games that Microsoft put out during that time period. So, yeah, I think that's a good example of how we've already seen how Game Pass has degraded the quality of games in a very significant way. Because during the PS3 and 360 era, they were basically on par with each other, Sony and Microsoft were, in terms of the quality of exclusive content. So, what changed between then and now? It's because people are complacent. When games are part of a subscription service, developers and publishers feel less compelled to take risks or innovate because they have a guaranteed revenue stream from the Game Pass subscription. So the pressure to deliver a standout title is diminished. So as a consequence, there's a tendency now to rely on established formulas, leading to the creative stagnation and lack of genuine evolution. And that's going to happen in the Call of Duty series when it comes to Game Pass. It's only going to get worse. These issues that already exist with the Call of Duty series, creative stagnation, lack of innovation, you think that's going to improve when it's tied to a subscription service? Are you fucking delusional? Another point that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. Regarding the monetization aspect of Game Pass, there is a very strong possibility, I would say a very strong likelihood, that Microsoft is going to lean more heavy on live services, DLC, microtransactions, all the things that we all loathe in the modern age of video games. Well, we're going to see a lot more of it the more prevalent Game Pass gets, because they need to compensate for the lower revenue. Because Game Pass operates on a subscription model where players pay a fixed monthly fee for access to games. Well, since this fee is significantly lower than the cost of purchasing individual games, the revenue that Microsoft would get from Game Pass will be significantly lower than if it was just for $70 and everyone had to pay for it. Okay? So, their revenue per player is going to be decreased. And they paid $60 billion for Call of Duty. So to make up for this inevitable shortfall, there is probably going to be a stronger focus on monetization avenues alternative to the actual price of the game itself, for the price of entry. So we're going to have a lot more live service, a lot more DLC. DLC has kind of been phased out, but I think it's actually going to come back, like individual expansions. They already did it with a few games like The Outer Worlds, which was part of Game Pass, but if you were a Game Pass subscriber and you wanted the DLC, you had to pay separately for the DLC content. So that will be another thing that, like, we might get map packs back in Call of Duty. And microtransactions as well are also going to be expanded upon. They're going to try to increase revenue as much as they possibly can, because the Game Pass model is simply not sustainable. Even if Game Pass reaches 300 million subscribers in the next few years, it's still, you can't spend hundreds of millions of dollars on each and every one of these games. And the library is only expanding between Bethesda, Activision, their first-party lineup, and they're probably going to buy more companies, let's keep it real. So it's just going to keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger, but they can't keep it up unless they just release games very, very, sparingly. So Call of Duty may no longer have an annual cycle, which is very possible, but it's still, at the end of the day, not a sustainable enough model to, like, just rely on the subscription cost alone, because that's being split multiple different ways across multiple different costs, multiple different development teams developing multiple different games. Like, we're seeing it with Netflix, and Netflix is so much bigger than Game Pass will probably ever be in terms of money, in terms of subscribers and all that stuff. We're seeing the struggles with subscriptions as it pertains to TVs and movies. Well, video games are a lot more expensive and they require a lot more resources than a movie or a show ever could, especially when we're talking about the big budget stuff. So it's going to be more significant with the video game industry than what we're already seeing right now with our very eyes, with Netflix, HBO Max, Paramount Plus, Peacock, etc., etc. I mean, HBO Max is doing something crazy. Oh no, it's just called Max now. But they're doing something that has never been done before, where in order to get revenue back, because they're not really making any money off of it, they're actually selling their own shows that they created specifically for their own service. They're selling it out to other services. And last year, Netflix, for the very first time, after so many years of refusing, they caved in to the ad-supported model in order to try to gain subscribers. That hasn't really worked out so well for them. But yeah, the ad-supported thing is another big thing, because it just shows that these services, based on a subscription alone, just don't get enough revenue to keep all of these TV shows and movies going. So they need to expand their revenue, and introducing ad tiers is a way that they're doing that. So that's probably another thing you guys can look forward to with video games, is getting more advertisements in them, whether it's more subtle with just billboards in the actual in-game, like think of like Grand Theft Auto, or play this ad before you play, like in between loading sessions or whatever the hell. Like, I could see that happening too. So I'm like, if all this shit is going on right now with TV and movies, video games, again, costs way more money than a show or a movie does. It's going to be a lot worse as far as just the lack of sustainability and prosperity. What makes the video game industry unique, though, is that there are multiple different ways to monetize a game. So they're definitely going to capitalize off of that. The predatory microtransactions, the shitty battle passes, and the just you name it. Everything that is just shit and makes video games just less fun, it's all going to be there. Make no mistake about it, it's all going to be there. Because Microsoft will have no other choice but to implement that shit. And because there's greater pressure under a subscription model to make up for more lost revenue, then it stands to reason that there's going to be even more predatory shit than there already is in the current video game industry. So, 5 to 10 years from now, people are going to think that this was nothing. What we're going through right now is nothing. Yeah, I think it's going to be really bad. The shift towards a more monetization-focused model will bring with it gameplay elements that prioritize profits over the overall gameplay experience. What's going to happen is it's going to erode the fair and enjoyable experiences that players expect from a full-price game. Granted, it's something that's already been happening in the video game industry and the Call of Duty series to be particular, but again, every single bad thing that you can possibly think of in modern gaming is going to be multiplied by 10 with this subscription bullshit. Just because it's on PlayStation, just because it's on Nintendo, doesn't mean that people aren't still going to flock to Game Pass in order to play this game. It's going to be a massive selling point, a massive influx of new people coming into Game Pass just because of Call of Duty. It's guaranteed to happen. That's why Sony was terrified of this deal, and why they are absolutely just devastated that it went through, because it's going to be bad for them. They're going to lose a lot of money, even though Microsoft is committed to putting the games on PlayStation. That's not what Sony's concerned about, because people are still not going to buy the game on PlayStation, even if it's on PlayStation, because if you only pay $15 a month for not just the new Call of Duty, but all the Call of Duty games, plus all the Bethesda games, plus all of the Microsoft games, it's a no-brainer. You're going to switch to Game Pass. You know, and the more and more games that come onto the service, and PlayStation may try to counteract that, but yeah, I think there's just so much momentum going in Microsoft's direction. Call of Duty is by far the best-selling franchise on the PlayStation consoles. That's how it's been since the PS3. So it's not a good thing for Sony. They're going to lose a lot of money as a result of this. People are not going to pay $70 for something that they can get for basically nothing. And in a few years, it won't even matter if it's on a different platform or not, because they won't necessarily have to buy an Xbox if they can stream it from their phone. So it's not as if that, oh, you have a PlayStation 5, you already bought it for $500, and you don't want to buy a Series X and all the stuff. You can literally just get it for free, or just with a subscription, download the Game Pass app on your phone, and you're good to go. As terrible as the streaming technology is, it's still going to be attractive to a lot of people coming from PlayStation. Be like, well, all I need is my phone and a controller and a Game Pass subscription. I'm in. It's going to have millions of people are going to do this, guaranteed. They're not going to pay $70 for Call of Duty on PlayStation. Rather, they're just going to get it on Game Pass. So many people are going to make the switch. If Microsoft didn't believe that, they wouldn't spend as much money as they did for Activision. So I think that that's definitely what is going to end up happening. And realistically, if Sony really starts to compete with Game Pass, they have their whatever stupid PlayStation Plus shit, but it's nothing compared to Game Pass, really. So let's say that they start to compete. What do they have that could possibly come close to counteracting Call of Duty, which has just become such a staple in modern video game culture? It is by far the best-selling, most played, most culturally relevant video game franchise of all time. You just can't compete with that. I mean, they would have to try to match Microsoft in terms of like just how much stuff they have on there, but Sony's a much smaller company than Microsoft, realistically. PlayStation is the only thing they have that is really making them money at this point. Sony in the 1980s is a lot different from Sony today. All their TVs and phones and all the stuff that used to make them a lot of money, no one really gives a shit about anymore. So aside from PlayStation and the Sony Music, because they still have a lot of pull in the music industry, other than those two things and maybe Columbia Pictures every now and then, you know, there's a big movie that makes a lot of money. Really, like Into the Spider-Verse is like the only main one at this point. But yeah, it's just, you can't compare. So it's not as if Sony can just write a check and buy EA. They couldn't afford it. Sony, never mind, Nintendo is a bigger company than Sony. They're worth more money and they generate more revenue, and they're just a gaming company. So I think that speaks volumes to not just how big Nintendo is, but how small Sony is. So I don't see, like, you know, the whole idea of a monopoly, people chaffed at that. Like, oh, yeah, Sony complaining about monopoly. They sell more consoles than Microsoft, but it's not about console sales anymore. The entire game has changed, and Microsoft's winning it. They just are. They are so far ahead of the competition, it's not even funny. They have a huge head start, huge advantage in the video game subscription market, which is, sadly, the future of gaming, because people don't see how much it's going to cause so much damage. People, oh, but $15 a month for all these games. Well, you get what you pay for in what is essentially the EBT card of the video game industry. Like, you think I'm being hyperbolic. You think I'm making shit up. And you think that, well, the game's, because Microsoft owns it now, it's going to get better. Look, I hate Activision too. I think they're a bunch of scumfucks. But just because a bigger company now has swallowed them up and the company's under new management, new leadership, doesn't automatically mean that it's good leadership and that it's better leadership. Microsoft is the same company, okay? Their flagship FPS franchise, before now obviously, but for many years, it was the Halo series. Halo was the pinnacle of FPS gaming for many, many years, from the early to late 2000s. Basically, from Halo 1 until, I would say, Halo 3. Because Halo Reach has its fans. I'm not a huge fan of it, but it still left a pretty big mark back in its day. Overshadowed by Call of Duty, of course, even in 2010. But for many years, it was the best thing that Microsoft had going for it. The number one franchise. If you think of Mario when you think of Nintendo, if you think of Sonic when you think of Sega, you think of Master Chief when you think of Xbox, or at least you used to, because the direction of the Halo series, ever since 343 took over, has not been good. I mean, it's the same kind of thing. People said with Halo 4 it couldn't get worse. With Halo 5 it couldn't get worse. Granted, the multiplayer was a lot better than Halo 4, but the single player was so much worse that people generally consider it a worse game overall than Halo 4. And also, they promised that they were going to give us split screen for multiplayer and for co-op, but they never did. That was a broken promise. But they promised that they were going to bring it back for Halo Infinite, and Halo Infinite was going to be the return to form for the Halo series, and was going to be the renaissance for Halo. Well, we all know how that turned out. Yeah, Halo Infinite, and it didn't even have a lot of competition that year. It was the same year that Battlefield 2042 and Call of Duty Vanguard came out. So the fact that they couldn't make an impression during that time, and to make matters worse, they actually delayed the game by a year. It was supposed to come out a year before. I can't even imagine what that game would have been if that happened. But it's like, you guys think that with adding all of these new games and new series to Game Pass and expanding the library and having all these games day and date for Game Pass, that's a sustainable thing. Halo is literally their flagship franchise, their number one franchise that has made them the most money and is what they are most known for. Halo Infinite gets drip-fed content. Like, every few months there's like 2 maps or whatever the fuck, if you're lucky. And they just haven't been able to sustain a player base that's with the multiplayer, by the way, being completely free to play for everybody, whether or not you have Game Pass. Oh, but at least we have the Forge, you know, something that existed in previous Halo games. And it's just like the same mentality, though, as Bethesda. We're going to let the community basically make the game for us instead of us making the game and keeping it relevant. We're going to rely on the player base to do that for us. And that even hasn't worked out so well. I mean, that tweet that I reacted to the other day, where this Sony fanboy was bragging about Spider-Man having like 4 times the player count right now on Steam, like 8,000 versus 2,000 for Halo Infinite. Like, it seems ridiculous. Like, people were saying, oh, but that doesn't count the people that are playing through Game Pass. But if it's free, if you're a PC gamer, you don't need Game Pass to play it for free. You're going to get it on Steam because Steam is just a better platform than the shitty little Xbox app that you use for Game Pass. Like, yeah, so I don't buy that first. Like, most of the players that are playing it on PC are playing it through Steam. There is no doubt about that, and the PC player base is probably at least just as strong as the console at this point. So Halo Infinite, nobody gives a shit about. It's dead. And that's their top number 1 fucking game. Like, are you kidding me? So, like, why do you think that's going to be any better for Call of Duty? Oh, yeah, and by the way, like, the promise they made for the split screen being back in Halo Infinite after it was left out of Halo 5, they broke that promise as well. And I think it really just shows how uninformed your average consumer is, because I was having this discussion with a coworker who considers himself to be a pretty avid gamer. I mean, he spends a lot of time every day playing video games. Basically, after work, he's playing, like, Ark, or he plays a shit ton of games. Like, definitely more than I do at this point. So he considers himself, like, a really, you know, strong, hardcore gamer that knows a lot about video games, because he's played them his whole life. But when we were having this whole discussion about Microsoft and Activision during break, you know, I was basically saying the same thing. Is like, there is no reason to be excited about this because of what Microsoft and their proven track record with Halo. That's their number 1 franchise, and look how shit Halo has become. And this guy, he's a big Halo fan, so that's why I specifically brought up Halo to him. But he said, no, that wasn't Microsoft, that was 343. 343 ruined Halo, not Microsoft. And I'm like, well, who does the head of 343 report to? They report to Phil Spencer. And who is Phil Spencer? He is the head of Xbox. And Phil Spencer reports to the CEO of Microsoft. So it's like, how can you, like, absolve Microsoft from all the responsibility? They're the ones that made 343, the developer of the Halo series, for a decade, ever since Bungie left and started doing their Destiny shit, and they left Microsoft and split and went their own way. It's like, how do people, like, there's so many people. It's not just him, though. I've seen so many people online trying to say, like, whenever anyone brings up Halo and Microsoft, it's like, oh, but that was 343, not Microsoft. Like, your average person is not very smart. I'm just going to put it that way. So I really don't get where all this optimism is coming from. I just don't. Because it's not based off of reality. It's not based off what we've seen from Microsoft over the past 10 years. Name one Microsoft franchise that is better off now than it was 10 years ago. You can name a lot of them for Sony, like God of War. And with Nintendo, you can argue that the Legend of Zelda series has never been more popular, never been more relevant, and never been more successful. Mario is still a big deal 40 goddamn years later. So Nintendo definitely knows what they're doing in maintaining their IPs. Xbox and Microsoft, they're the odd man out. They don't know jack shit about that. What it all comes down to is that the acquisition of Activision by Microsoft, it creates a situation where one mega corporation holds an enormous amount of power in the gaming industry, and in the case of Microsoft, just our everyday lives. This consolidation stifles competition, limits innovation, and ultimately leads to complacency, as the absence of strong alternatives will result in reduced motivation to improve and deliver exceptional products. In celebrating this acquisition, we inadvertently support the further consolidation of power in the hands of a single entity. Creates a dangerous precedent where a select few corporations dictate the direction of an entire industry. We're already seeing it with news media. That's been a thing where, like, 6 companies control 90% of all the media we have. That's just one example. I think with this, it's just going to give even more power and influence to a company that's already massive as hell. So while some may celebrate the Microsoft Activision deal as a monumental move that can be nothing but a positive thing, it's essential to critically analyze the consequences of such corporate consolidation. Supporting the dominance of megacorporations only serves to undermine competition, limit consumer choice, and foster an environment of complacency, especially as the subscription model of video games becomes more and more prevalent. And Microsoft's track record with the first-party titles they already have, including Halo, which is their #1 series, it definitely raises legitimate concerns about the future of the Call of Duty franchise. So instead of blindly celebrating this acquisition, I think it's crucial to question the long-term implications and advocate for a diverse and competitive gaming industry that prioritizes the interest of players over corporate interests.